Hello, everyone. This is Mahadeva the Thunder Wizard. All right, so today I am going to continue my reading of my book, Awakening Sleipnir. There's the cover right there. And as always, I'm just going to do my editorial comments if things have changed or if I think there's something worthy of talking about. I'll stop and share my thoughts, and then if there's people on here, we'll do question and answer. Before I forget, subscribe, hit the bell button. Lockdown.thunderwizard.com. We're still doing that, and I'll keep doing that as long as things are crazy with all this COVID-19 stuff. And you save $3,000. Is that what? $3,214. I give you $3,214 worth of stuff, and I give it all to you for free. The only thing that you pay for in that package is 5 personal services that you get from me outside of that $3,214 stuff, which we do via Skype. Everything else is free. So when things get back to normal, I will stop that promotion. Thunderwizard.com is my subscription site, and there's all levels of subscription. And if you want to support the channel, but you don't have a ton of money, and you want access to hundreds of hours of in-depth training in shamanism and manifestation, you can go there and you can start just at $25 a month. If you don't like it, you can unsubscribe. I promise you won't get through all of those videos, even at the $25 level, in 1 month. I guarantee you that. And then courses.thunderwizard.com has all of my other stuff, books and DVDs and things like that. But most of that is in the lockdown package. All right, let's get going. Let's read the book here. So we are now in the third part of this reading, which means I've gotten through, only gotten through 42 pages of my PDF. When I wrote it, I put it onto a PDF, so I'm at 42 of 153 pages. So it's going to take a while. All right, so here we go. All right, so this next little chapter is called How to Read This Book. Just let me once again say, I had no idea how big this book was going to be when I started writing it. I thought I was going to be writing one fairly short book. And as I was writing it up to this point, I thought I was going to be one book. And by the time I got into it, I realized it was huge. So I made it into 2 books. So this is the first one. All right, so how to read this book. My initial desire in writing this work was to have a very linear flow to this book. But as I began writing, it became clear that spiritual information doesn't always work that way. The chapters in this book are set up in a loosely associated order for those who choose to read it in a linear fashion. But unlike a modern textbook, if you choose to skip around, you will not have missed out on needed information. So feel free to start at the beginning and follow the chapters in order, or you may also scan the table of contents and allow your intuition to guide you to any chapter in any specific order you like. Much of the information here will be interesting to the intellect at first read, but in my experience, once you personally practice the information here, you may gain a deeper understanding, and you may wish to revisit certain chapters to discover nuggets of truth that the intellect may have missed the first time around. For those new to pre-Christian Teutonic spirituality, you may benefit from starting from the beginning. For those who are not neophytes in the Northern tradition, then you may want to jump directly to your topics of interest. All right, so that was kind of a waste of time for us. But there was one thing here that is really important, and I can't stress this enough. If you're following me on this channel, and your way of following me is to log on and listen to me talk about stuff, and you're getting this intellectual understanding, and you want to ask intellectual questions about reincarnation or something like that, and you're not doing the practices, you're missing out on 99% of what this path is all about. So as I've said before, the best way to get started, if you're brand new, is to type in Huul breath, H-U-U-L breath. Type it in pretty much anywhere, and you'll find videos where I teach you how to do that. The practices are the thing to do. All the other stuff is talk, and all the talk I do is to help you understand the practices. That's why I tend to have such lack of empathy and patience for people who just come on and ask these random intellectualized questions, because you're not doing the practices. The practices are really what's most important. All right, let's keep going. Oops, I hit the wrong thing. I don't want that. Sorry, give me a second. I accidentally hit the wrong program here. I just want to, come on, and then let's quit that. And then let's go back to what I really want to look at, which is this. All right. Next chapter, called Our Ancestors. Every indigenous culture and religion places great emphasis on honoring their ancestors. It is only with the advent of the monotheist religions, specifically the Abrahamic monotheist religions, that we see ancestor worship disappear as a foundation of human religion. In traditional religions, the ancestors are seen as the guiding spiritual forces for the tribe. It is possible that ancestor worship preceded deity worship in human evolution. Pre-Christian Teutonic religion is steeped in ancestor veneration. Animism, which is another word for shamanism, especially draws heavily from ancestor veneration. So it is only fitting that any aspiring Teutonic shaman seek out guidance from their ancestors to give them wisdom in their wizard training. So let us first look to our ancient European ancestors. In parentheses, before we discuss Teutonic origins, we should probably address European origins in general and the ancestors of all Europeans. Most of the previously held theories for the origin of the European people and the resulting debates surrounding them have become obsolete in the light of recent DNA evidence that has conclusively proven that all humans on the planet are descended from two individuals in Africa more than 70,000 years ago. More like 100,000 years ago. Through chromosomal DNA, every person alive today can trace their roots back through to their father, to one man who lived in Africa around 70,000 years ago. Through mitochondrial DNA, every person alive today can trace their roots back to their mother, to one woman in Africa around 100,000 years ago. This is not theory. This is fact. It is proven. So all of the nonsense you hear, people want to ask me about, blood types and DNA and, it's all nonsense. If you're a modern human, you are descended from a species of bipedal hominid that we today call Homo sapiens sapiens, the knowing man. And so that's how far we go back. All right, let's see. One interesting twist to this story that has recently emerged is that every person who can trace their ancestry to somewhere in the northern hemisphere has 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in their bodies. This means that those first modern humans who migrated into the northern hemisphere from Africa must have interbred with indigenous Neanderthals. Neanderthals were physically much more powerful than Homo sapiens, so that makes it unlikely that they were forced into mating with their modern human rivals. This fact indicates to me that our previous theories of Neanderthal extinction at the hands of humans to be less likely. If humans were running around committing genocide against Neanderthals, how is it that they willingly mated with us? Some scientists have concluded that Neanderthals did not go extinct. They merely merged over time, were absorbed with the more numerous Homo sapiens that began surrounding them. So in a very real sense, we Europeans are both of African and Neanderthal descent. I'm going to get into it here. Neanderthals are descended from called Homo heidelbergensis, which is also a species of humans that also came from Africa. Just before somebody says, "Oh, we're not from Africa, we're from Neanderthals." Well, if you want to claim 100% Neanderthal ancestry, you've still got the same thing. It's just they came from Africa 200,000 years earlier. So you're still African. Sorry. Homo heidelbergensis hominids had entered Europe hundreds of thousands of years earlier than modern humans from Africa and evolved into Neanderthals. They had become highly specialized humans that were designed to thrive in Ice Age conditions. But they were too specialized, as it turns out. As climate conditions changed, our Neanderthal cousins simply could not adapt, and they either died out or were forced to merge with Homo sapiens in order to survive. Modern Homo sapiens ancestors in Africa, however, had evolved into highly adaptable creatures. All modern humans are descended from a small band of humans who were forced to adapt to massive climate change in their African homeland. It was not an easy transformation. We almost became extinct. Those first modern humans emerged from a very small number of surviving Homo sapiens that spawned the modern human race. This climate change that reduced the human population is why we are so able to trace our roots back to these two people in Paleolithic Africa. The resulting mental strengths that allowed our ancestors to survive climate change is what made us different from our Neanderthal cousins. Neanderthals had larger brains than we do, but their brains work differently than ours do. It is believed that Neanderthals had the powers of speech, but they lacked the ability to think abstractly, or at least not as abstractly as we do. This is all conjecture, by the way. People are just trying to figure out why they died. Truth is, we don't know. Neanderthals tended to stay in one spot, whereas humans tended to migrate with the seasons and with animal herds. That does seem to be true. It is believed that Neanderthals could get lost in the moment, whereas modern humans could think farther into the future and contemplate imagined abstract scenarios with more detail. By the way, that's one of the reasons why most people are right-handed, because we evolved to be able to have a spear-throwing hand, which is why men tend to be, throw balls better than women most of the time. You give, a baseball to, generally speaking, to women, they tend not to be able to throw it as well. Men have can throw it. That goes all the way back to throwing spears. And so men tended to be the ones that use spears more often, so they developed a stronger right hand than their left. And that's why, we have that. That's why we're right and left-handed. Nowadays, the world is a very crowded place, and in this crowded environment, it is only natural that people want to protect their resources from others. This, in my opinion, is why modern humans are so prone to warfare. The theories that suggest that humans must have driven out previous populations, in my opinion, reflects a modern assumption that humans have always acted like they do now. So while it is an understandable modern assumption, it may not be accurate. And, I'm thinking about this now, and I'm trying to figure out why I wrote this. I think I was trying to point out that earlier in time we weren't so xenophobic, which means we weren't afraid of differences. Xeno means different, phobic means fear. We didn't have a fear of differences, means we weren't racist, we weren't, and I'm going to talk about it here. When you're, there's not a whole lot of humans out there. When you bump into another human, it's a big deal, and you want to get together and share things and find out information and help each other. But when we get really crowded, that's when we start getting territorial. All right, so in my youth, meaning in my 20s, I used to do a lot of wilderness backpacking in Sequoia National Forest, high in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. The wilderness in that area is very isolated country that can only be accessed by foot or on horseback. One must hike up very steep mountainsides to access the backcountry. This limits the amounts of people that are able or willing to enter some of these areas. Once you can access the most remote areas, it is possible to spend weeks without seeing another person. If someone has never experienced this kind of isolation, it is hard to understand the effect that wilderness isolation can have on a person. Not only do you not see anybody, but you don't have access to any, nowadays, your phone would be useless up there, I think. This was before cell phones when I was doing it. No radio, no cell phone, no nothing. I am by nature a very solitary person. I hate crowds and usually avoid people unless I have a purpose. However, even after a few days of isolation in the wilderness without the distraction of technology like TV, radio, or internet, Internet didn't exist in my early adulthood, I would become very aware of the need for human contact. Unlike my usual solitary behavior, after a few days of isolation, I would eagerly stop and talk to any other hikers I saw, even if it was just empty talk about the weather. I usually despise empty small talk. And one other aspect to living in isolation in the wilderness is that it can be difficult. If you want to have an idea of how dependent we moderners are on technology to survive, please try some type of wilderness camping with limited supplies. You will find out very quickly that tools become very, very important. My point is that isolation in wilderness with little technology to survive does not engender warfare, it fosters cooperation. For the past 2,000 years at the least, humans have been pretty numerous on this planet and hence have always been in some kind of competition for resources. This is what causes wars. I'm quite certain that if human populations were to be reduced to the numbers seen in these Paleolithic times, we're talking like, 50,000 years ago. I think it was a whole different world back then. We would see vast increase in human cooperation because cooperation between differing groups would facilitate survival. Deliberate isolation would be very counterproductive to survival. For me, in the wilderness, after a week or so of hiking, I would usually be low on some supply or other, whether it be food or fishing line or thread or something. So whenever I saw another human, I would be very eager to inquire if they had any surplus of whatever it was I needed. Sometimes a granola bar would be like gold because it usually contained sugar and salt, which were very needed nutrients. Sugar for instant calories and salt, which was good to recover from all the sweating I was doing. There's a reason why we love our sugar and salt. It's because these things are not so easy to find in large quantities in nature, and yet they are necessary for our survival. In other words, the thing that, fast food, the reason why we love fast food is because we have our technology has advanced so rapidly, our human evolution has not evolved to dislike that. If we were to stay as we are for another 20,000 years or something, I'm fairly certain that we would evolve to a place where people wouldn't want, those foods just wouldn't taste good because those nutrients are so easy to get. But when you don't have it, even fake sugar is really necessary. All right. Normally, when I wasn't alone in my desire to obtain these kinds of things. Anyone I met in the backcountry was in a similar predicament because the only way they could get there was by hoofing it for days, with only what they could carry on their back. These chance meetings would usually result in some kind of trade or barter. Normally when I camp, I want to be completely alone, but in the backcountry, even after just a few days of isolation, I would welcome the opportunity to camp alongside another person to enjoy the fireside chats. Most often these were people I probably would not socialize with under normal urban situations because of a lack of common interest. But in the wilderness, just the fact that it was another person, another human being, was enough for me. I found that it was a necessity for humans to reinforce their uniquely it was a necessity for humans to reinforce their uniquely human interpretation of the world. It solidified my humanness. There were times when I went for 2 weeks with no human contact at all, and I felt as though I was going to lose my human identity and slip into another dimension. And I'm not hyperbolizing. I really did feel I was going to just disappear into the woods. Like stop physically existing. While this was very helpful for my early visionary shamanic experiences, it was also very unnerving and discomforting from a human perspective. So, under those conditions, any human contact helped ground me and solidify me. I share this because I believe it is the idea of security, not insecurity, that makes us more defensive, so we can protect whatever it is we think we own. For early humans, especially those very early humans, the world was huge and it was filled with some really nasty animals. In Ice Age Europe, there were cave bears that dwarfed modern grizzly bears. There were cave lions, bison, the mighty aurochs, Ice Age wolves, leopards, elk with antlers 10 feet wide, Ice Age rhinoceros, etc. For humans that only had stone tools and spears for survival, who were the minority in that amazing time, it would have only been in everyone's best interest to join forces, share tools, information, strategies, technology, and supplies. I have no doubt that unlike today, where we seek to keep our technological discoveries secret from our neighbors out of fear, I feel confident our Ice Age human ancestors would only be too happy to share and learn as much as possible from any strangers they encountered. Since we now know humans interbred with Neanderthals, we know there was at least some cooperation between the two species. This would only make sense. Neanderthals were physically very strong and well suited for Ice Age life. Cro-Magnons, modern humans, had superior tools and technology and a more complex form of abstract thinking which supported flexibility and adaptability. The intermixing of these traits would be helpful to both sides. It has been determined that Neanderthals carried the gene for light skin, light eyes, and red hair. These are traits found predominantly in European genetics. So perhaps Europeans get their distinctive pale skin, eyes, and hair from interbreeding of Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals. The question of race. One unanswered question concerning these first modern humans in Europe is, what did they look like? From my research, no one seems to really know for sure. There is some controversy regarding this, but before we tackle this question, let's look at modern Europeans today. The last ice age ended around 8 to 10,000 years ago. Up until that time, Europe had been in and out of ice ages for hundreds of thousands of years. The pigmentation of modern Europeans is probably a result of 40,000 years of living in ice age conditions, nothing more, nothing less. While some racialists may want to ascribe some kind of spiritual meaning to the color of their skin and eyes, the truth is that the skin coloration of white people is simply because our ancestors lived in very cold conditions for tens of thousands of years and were forced to keep their skin covered with protective clothing, or were forced to stay sheltered from the elements for prolonged periods. This meant that there was only a very small percentage of skin on the body that was open to any available sunlight. This reduced the amount of vitamin D our ancestors were able to absorb from the sunlight through their skin. Humans need vitamin D to survive, so the lightening of our skin was simply a minor evolutionary adaptation to ensure the survival of humans in Ice Age Europe. It is also possible that early modern humans in Europe obtained the gene for red hair, light eyes, and pale skin from interbreeding with their Neanderthal neighbors. As a shaman, I find this prospect very exciting because that means I may be able to access the ancestral memories from my Neanderthal DNA more easily. I actually did have a shamanic journey where I went back and I had, this whole vision of me being a Neanderthal. It was really, really quite interesting. Anyway, but also the possibility of Europeans getting their physical traits from a more primitive race of humans certainly doesn't lend itself to the idea that people with light skin are any more advanced than other humans. So there is no spiritual genesis for the skin color of Europeans. Skin, hair, and eye color are simply the result of Mother Nature altering our appearance to enhance our survival skills depending on our environmental needs. While it may seem ridiculous for me to state the obvious in this modern day and age, there are unfortunately a significant number of neo-heathens who ascribe some kind of spiritual significance for the unique physical attributes of Europeans. I want to be very clear that I do not subscribe to any of these racialist ideas in any way whatsoever. Science has determined that the only differences between the so-called races are literally only skin deep. Skin color, hair, eye color, face shape, etc. are adaptations helpful for interacting with local environments. Our insides, however, are identical in all races. Once you peel back the outer skin and look within, all modern humans are identical in every respect. It means that underneath we are all modern Africans. Getting back to the appearance of those early Cro-Magnon European humans, we just don't know. We know that their bones were thicker and they were more muscular than all modern humans are, but we don't know their skin color. Modern Northern Europeans still have light skin and light eyes, even though the last ice age ended 10,000 years ago. If modern Europeans have not yet begun to adapt to a warmer post-ice age conditions with darker skin, then that seems to indicate to me that it probably took longer than 10,000 years for those first Europeans to develop lighter skin. If the first cave paintings of Europe were drawn 35,000 to 40,000 years ago, and modern humans did not arrive in Europe until 50,000 years ago at the earliest, as science currently believes, then that would mean that those first cave painters in France were probably dark-skinned and still reflected their recent African genetic roots in their physical appearance. The earliest art in the world was created by these Paleolithic European cave painters. The earliest human carvings are found in Europe during this time also. Some busts of women carved at this time that were made out of ivory seem to have very similar facial and hair features as modern East Africans. This would only make sense since all modern humans are descended from a small band of humans that lived in East Africa around 100,000 years ago. While this is very interesting, it means that our stereotypical modern European with light skin and light eyes probably did not emerge until after prolonged exposure to Ice Age conditions, perhaps after tens of thousands of years. If this is true, then the first Europeans were not white people, yet for us modern white folks, if we want to access our deepest European roots, we should acknowledge that this process entails accessing our true heritage, namely that we are all Africans under the skin. The Indo-Europeans. For those not interested in the racial controversies surrounding modern neo-heathenism, you may want to skip this section and move right on to the chapter Modern European Ancestry. For those on the fence or those who wish to arm themselves with actual objective scientific data concerning the racial background of the Teutonic people, read on. As you may know, the Germanic language branch is one branch of the Indo-European language family. The other Indo-European language branches include Celtic, Slavic, Sanskrit, Persian, Hittite, extinct, Tocharian, extinct, Greek, Roman, Albanian, and Armenian. You can see that the people who speak these languages live within a huge territory extending from Iceland to India. For hundreds of years, linguists and archaeologists have been speculating as to the original homeland of the first Indo-European tribes. It had been theorized that the religions of all the different Indo-European peoples were descended from an original Indo-European culture that was thought to have existed somewhere in Central Asia or Anatolia, which then spread out in different directions about 7,000 years ago. As we shall see, this original Indo-European migration theory has been conclusively proven false by the Paleolithic continuity paradigm. The coining of the term Indo-European. After the discovery of the similarity between the Sanskrit language of India and European languages, which resulted in the formulation of the Indo-European language hypothesis, the de facto scientific theory for the foundation of European language and culture for many years, it was the case when I was in college, I remember reading it in books, was that Indo-European speaking warriors emerged from the steppes of Russia around 7,000 years ago and swept into Europe, India, Asia, and the Middle East, conquering all that stood in their way. It was believed that these Indo-Europeans then imposed their language, culture, and religion onto the indigenous hunter-gatherers they conquered. The fusion of the supposed original Indo-European language with the indigenous languages supposedly resulted in the multiple Indo-European languages and cultures previously mentioned. While this may have been true in the case of the Aryans, who invaded India and the Iranian plateau 7,000 years ago, in terms of the rest of Europe and Central Asia, this theory may no longer be so airtight. The emergence of the Paleolithic continuity paradigm, or PCP. A new scientific paradigm has emerged in recent decades that shatters the old theories concerning Indo-European origins. The important difference between a theory and a paradigm is this. A theory is often proposed by one person in one scientific discipline. A paradigm is a consensual conclusion reached simultaneously by multiple people in multiple scientific disciplines. The obvious difference between a theory and a paradigm is that a paradigm carries much more weight than a theory. So, in other words, a theory is, you've got, let's say, Albert Einstein. He's trying to figure out gravity and space-time and all that, and he comes up with the theory of relativity. So he's this one guy who comes up with this one theory, right? A paradigm would be if you have, in this case, we're talking about the origins of the Indo-European people. So you've got these different scientific disciplines, they're not talking to each other. So you've got genetics. So they're looking at genetics, they're looking at the origins of people, and they're finding certain things out about where Indo-European people came from. And then you have linguistics. Linguistics is looking at language and following where language is going and how it changes, and they're coming up with their ideas of where the first Indo-Europeans came from. Then you have archaeology. So archaeologists are digging things up and they're following the clues, and they come to their own conclusion about the origins of Indo-European people. And they all were coming to the same conclusion independently. So all of these geneticists and linguists and archaeologists and historians all come together and they start, yeah, that's what I was, yeah, and they come up with this same idea independently. That's a paradigm. So you see why that's more powerful than just a theory. The previous theory, if I don't explain it in here, I'll explain to you why people still walk around saying that 7,000 years ago, these Indo-European horse warriors came out of nowhere and conquered all of Europe and gave everybody their language. And you'll find out why that's ridiculous. All right, so recent independent scientific evidence from multiple disciplines, including genetics, linguistics, and archaeology, are painting a very different ethnic, linguistic, and cultural genesis of Europe than was previously believed. This new theory states that language is very, very, very old and is much sturdier than genetics. In other words, why your genetics change. In other words, why can you take the DNA of a modern Hindu who speaks an Indo-European language and then go take some guy from Iceland who speaks another Indo-European language, and you compare their DNA and you see that they're not the same. So people go, oh, they're not related to each other. Well, that's because you could have somebody, two people, brothers, one goes off and he stays in India, another one goes off to Iceland. You come back 50,000 years later, 30,000 years later, you will see that they have evolved, they have adapted, their DNA has changed simply by being in a different locale for a long period of time. So this is why it's so important for everybody to be able to think in larger ways. People are so isolated in their thinking. You know, this is my hubris, but they just sound so stupid to me. It just sounds ridiculously stupid not to be able to think in larger terms. It just drives me crazy. Scientists, academicians are not immune to this small-mindedness, the inability to look over large periods of time. People also have emotional, psychological biases and assumptions, which emotional attachments to their beliefs, which color the results of their conclusions. So it's important to be able to do that. Otherwise, you end up coming up with really wrong, stupid, idiotic theories like the Indo-European horse warrior, conquest of the world nonsense. All right, so the previous out of Asia theory for the Indo-European language, and here's another one. I still try, linguists all agree. Languages like the Asian languages came from Paleolithic Africa. Other languages came from Paleolithic Africa. There's no dispute about that. For some reason, Indo-European didn't come out of Paleolithic Africa. Nobody has been able to explain it to me. The only reason that I can think is that it's unconscious racism. Because it only makes sense. I mean, these are the same people who agree, oh yeah, we all came from Africa, but the language, where it just fell out of the sky somewhere? I was watching some documentary where somebody was talking about, the first Dravidians in India, and he was hypothesizing that these were humans before language, that somehow humans didn't have language until recently. This is ridiculous. Just the false, limited assumptions drives me crazy. All right, so the previous out of Asia theory for the Indo-European language seems to have been based on some faulty assumptions about the speed at which language changes among stable, isolated populations. Newer scientific evidence indicates that our languages may have existed relatively unchanged throughout our genetic and racial adaptations over tens of thousands of years. In other words, Our language may have stayed the same while over thousands of years our ethnicity changed because of our environment. So you have somebody 10,000 years or 20,000 years later who looks totally different. You look at his DNA, it doesn't match with the DNA of his ancient ancestors, but the language is the same. Got it? Unlike the previous theories stating that the Proto-Indo-European language arose only a few thousand years ago in Europe or Central Asia, that's just so ridiculous. In Europe or Central Asia, newer theories contend that the Proto-Indo-European language existed in Paleolithic Africa long before modern humans migrated to Europe and physically adapted into the multiple ethnic races we know of today. In other words, our language is older than our races and our skin colors. This, of course, turns any racialist arguments about the Indo-Europeans on its head. If someone wants to pride themselves in their Indo-European ancestry, such pride cannot be based on any white racial purity. Any pride from such ancestry can only be held in connection to language, religion, culture, and ideas that have transcended race for perhaps more than 100,000 years. When I was first drawn to the traditions of my Teutonic ancestry, I sought out my ancestors in vision. The information I received concerning the Hool breath led me to believe that my Teutonic ancestors were not recent immigrants to Europe from Central Asia 7,000 years ago. In these visions, I was led to believe that my ancestors were the first hunters of the Paleolithic age that had migrated into Europe from Africa 40,000 years ago. I was led to believe that the spiritual culture, traditions, and language of my ancestors evolved directly from some of these first Europeans who colonized what is now modern Germany. As I have already shared in my first book, this information was a shock to me, as I had always believed I was of Celtic descent. After doing some research on my family history and confirming that I was in fact of Germanic descent, I then had to confront my own racial prejudice against the Germanic peoples. I had such anger and guilt over the atrocities committed over the last 500 years by the Germanic cultures of the Nazis, the English, Anglo-Americans, and the Spanish. Yes, modern Spain was founded by Gothic invaders from Scandinavia after the fall of Rome. I had a very difficult time accepting that I was of Germanic descent myself. After reading Roman historical accounts of the ancient pre-Christian Germanic tribes and studying the language of the pre-Roman Germanic tribes, I was relieved to learn that my pre-Christian Teutonic tribal ancestors were a deeply spiritual animist people who held little resemblance to the racist, destructive, imperialist, barbarian stereotype that I had equated with all the modern Germanic peoples. After continued research into the Norse myths, I was thrilled to find that there still existed a rich, detailed, and vibrant polytheist animist spiritual tradition among the pre-Christian Teutonic people. And so, I began my quest to recreate a modern Teutonic form of polytheist animist mysticism. I was ecstatic to discover that I had a direct ethnic connection to these original Teutonic animist shamans who, according to my visions, had developed this rich spiritual tradition over the span of tens of thousands of years in Europe based on their previous spiritual roots in Africa. My visions of my Paleolithic ancestors, while being very fulfilling on a personal level, were in direct conflict with the majority of the theories I had learned in college concerning the Indo-European invasion of Europe. For a time, in the beginning of my research, I clung to the visions I had received concerning the culture of my ancestors being aboriginal to Europe. Aboriginal means, from original. However, as time passed, I reluctantly resigned myself to the idea that the objective scientific evidence probably did not support my visions, and so I allowed myself to readopt the popular out of Central Asia hypothesis for the genesis of the Indo-European language, religion, and culture. But now, after more research into recent Paleolithic continuity paradigm evidence to the contrary, I once again have come to find that my original visionary intuitions may have been correct. In case you don't know what that is, I'll lay it out for you. PCP, Paleolithic. Paleolithic means old stone. Paleolithic means the Old Stone Age. It means before, means like tens of thousands of years ago. Paleolithic continuity paradigm. All right, where was I? But now, after more research into recent Paleolithic continuity paradigm evidence to the contrary, I have come to find that my original visionary intuitions may have been correct. DNA research has recently concluded that modern Europeans have genetic roots in Europe dating back to the Paleolithic age, 50,000 years ago. But I assumed that the Indo-European language, religion, and culture had been either imported into Europe from Central Asia or forced upon indigenous Europeans by a foreign minority Indo-European warrior elite 7,000 years ago. Let me just stop here for a second. Let's just assume that that's right. Let's just assume that the Indo-Europeans really did magically 7,000 years ago sprout out of the ground somewhere in the steppes of Russia and then just exploded all over the world, and in a matter of a couple thousand years completely, totally changed, got rid of all the old languages and cultures and religions. And even if that's the case, it still doesn't take away the question of where did they come from. They came from somewhere. They didn't just sprout out of the ground. The DNA in our bodies tells us where they came from. They came from Africa. So even if somebody says that, all that means is that for some reason, unique all over the world, people started creating their own language that was completely different from every other language on the planet. And they, even you're still left with the same questions. That's what I mean. People don't think past that. I've heard people give false, because there's a Russian geneticist, I think he's a geneticist, who wants to say that all Indo-European people came from Russia. And so people will say, oh no, white people came from Russia. But again, did they just sprout up out of the ground? They came from somewhere. And why people can't think beyond that is just the idiocy of people. It's got to be the most frustrating thing in the world for me. It just makes me want to force my opinion on them. All right. So, while the ethnic makeup of my Teutonic ancestors may have been descended from those first Paleolithic hunters, it seemed to me, until very recently, that the Indo-European religion and language of my ancestors might have been imported from Central Asian conquerors. As a result, I felt rather conflicted about the idea of a schism between my Paleolithic hunter-gatherer ancestors and my supposed Bronze Age warrior-conqueror ancestors. Had my Stone Age ancestors held different beliefs and understandings than the Indo-European conquerors? Had the supposed Bronze Age warriors committed atrocities when they were conquered by those Stone Age hunter-gatherers? I had a lot of questions that I did not think could be answered, as there were no written records of this supposed conquest of Europe by the Indo-Europeans. But thankfully, I was able to let all those questions go. Paleolithic continuity paradigm states that all of the Indo-European languages were descended from a very, very ancient Proto-Indo-European language that came to Europe with the first modern Homo sapiens migrating from Africa 50,000 years ago, or at least one wave. There were multiple waves, but one wave, there was these early Indo-Europeans who spoke a very early form of Indo-European. They brought that language with them into Europe, and of course their religion. The theory goes on to state that without any extreme external stimulation, language tends to change very slowly over time. The theory proposes, under the conditions that our Paleolithic ancestors lived, their language could have stayed relatively unchanged for tens of thousands of years. The modern tendency for language to change very rapidly is seen as a very recent event in history, resulting from unprecedented, intense external stimulation and integration from outside human communities, beginning in the Bronze Age. In other words, it's the continuous interaction with other cultures and religions that causes all of these changes. If you leave people alone, isolated, things will pretty much stay the same. It's just the way, things work. In Paleolithic ice ages, most communities were very isolated from other groups for thousands of years, and hence there was little need for language to change. In fact, it was in the interest of the survival of those early Europeans to keep language from changing, since the preservation of culture, language, and religion were crucial for their physical survival. This is because Ice Age life was very difficult, and it was through language that essential survival skills were passed down to one's offspring. According to the earlier, now debunked Indo-European invasion theory, the Indo-European conquerors are supposed to have introduced farming to the indigenous European Stone Age hunter-gatherers. However, according to the PCP, if this were the case, then those Indo-European farmers who originated words for farming would have introduced the original Indo-European root words for farming to all of the Neolithic farmers. These supposed new Indo-European words for farming would be easily traceable among the later resulting Indo-European dialects. Logically, then, all Indo-European languages would share the same root words for farming related to objects and activities. Oddly, however, each branch of the Indo-European language has different words for farming, which indicates farming had reached each of these language speakers long after the original Indo-Europeans had arrived and settled in Europe. And it also indicates that they were influenced by other groups of people that came in with whom they had contact. Conversely, all Indo-European languages share similar root words for hunting and fishing. This evidence indicates that these hunting and fishing activities were already cemented into the original Proto-Indo-European root language. This means that all Indo-European language was probably developed by Paleolithic nomad hunters from Africa, not Bronze Age warriors or farmers. As it turns out, farming was developed or introduced to the various pre-existing Indo-European cultures by non-Indo-European, Middle Eastern influences from towards the end of the Neolithic era. As a result, each Indo-European culture developed their own words relating to farming and agriculture after having been in their respective parts of Europe for tens of thousands of years. This also speaks to the myth of racial superiority. First Indo-European invasion theories were created during a time when racism was part and parcel of the Western scientific age. This original theory, the theory that is still taught, that people still spout as fact, that is probably still in the books, came from the 1700s, when people from Britain, they were, in India, and they were hearing, and these guys were reading Sanskrit, and they could see that the Sanskrit language had obviously a connection to Greek and Roman and even English. And so they just assumed, well, our European ancestors must have gone down and conquered them. And then they read the Vedas, and the Vedas do talk about the Aryans. The Aryans were people who came from the north of India and came down into what is now Pakistan. And from there they went into all of India. And so they just assumed, that must have been us. But just because people from Central Asia who called themselves Aryans came down into India and maybe conquered it and occupied it, does not mean that they came from Europe. So the inaccurate assumption, which was coming from the hubris of Europeans at that time who thought that they were, running the world, they go, we must have gone down there and conquered them. And that's where you get the word Indo-European, India, Europe. That word works because India and Europe do share a common language, or at least some of India and Europe, not all of it. But the theory behind it is total conjecture. And what happened after that is that all of historians and linguists and scientists sought to find evidence to prove what they already had decided they believed. So, and up until this day, up until, when I was in college back in the 80s, they were still teaching it. All right, let's keep going. The Indo-Europeans were thought to be light-skinned warriors with superior intelligence who brought their superior technology, religion, and culture and imposed this onto whatever inferior dark-skinned hunter-gatherer culture they conquered. But as recent DNA, archaeological, and now linguistic evidence confirms, the so-called white race emerged from these Paleolithic hunter-gatherers in Europe. The technologically superior cultures which did in fact bring farming, city-states, and modern warfare to Europe were from Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean region, Egypt, and the Middle East. In other words, they didn't come from white people. If we are to ascribe racial superiority to superior technology, then that would indicate that the supposed light-skinned Europeans were indeed inferior to some of the other supposed darker-skinned races in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean region. Now, of course, that isn't true either. The reason why farming and empires, city-states, evolved in the Middle East was because when the ice ages receded, what ended up happening is that it created these huge fertile plains in Mesopotamia. They're all desert now, but they were plains back then. And that's when it became really in their best interest to do things like have giant herds of cows, to plant huge fields of wheat and grain, to begin to start stockpiling things into silos, which then meant you created cities around the silos of grain to protect them, which meant you had an upper class that was inside of a city, and then you had a lower class, which were farmers. Then you turned those farmers into warriors to protect the city gates, and then those warriors went out and conquered all of the other people and turned them into slaves who did all of the work. That's where you got this from. So these people came up with all kinds of technologies for farming. And then as they went out, they started bringing those concepts to the people who didn't need it. People in Europe didn't need it. That's why they didn't come up with it. Because they lived in very natural settings, thick forests with lots of game and all that kind of stuff. So it didn't serve them to become farmers. And even into, when the Romans first contacted the Germanic tribes, they were seen as the most primitive people. And the historians make it very clear. They have really small herds of what they thought were sickly animals because they weren't bred to be these huge, giant, cows or horses or whatever. And they might have a couple of chickens and a couple of this and all that. But they, also went out and hunted. So they really, there was no need for them to come up with it. So it doesn't mean that the Mediterraneans or the Egyptians were smarter. It just means that where they lived dictated the technologies that they created. So either way you look at it, it's not that white people were stupider or that dark-skinned people were smarter or vice versa. It's that where you live dictates what you create. Your technology comes from your needs for survival. All right. Let's see, what did I say here? So debunking the Aryan origins mythology. Paleolithic continuity paradigm also seems to indicate that the actual Aryan warrior-farmer civilization did develop independently in Central Asia long after the other African-descended Indo-European languages, religions, and cultures were firmly established in Europe. In other words, all these African-speaking Proto-Indo-European move into all of these places into Europe and the Middle East, and then they start creating their own cultures and ethnicities over time. Right? You got that? That's the basis for what starts happening here. So they didn't come and conquer Europe, and they didn't conquer this. They did conquer India, but that looks like that's pretty much all that those Aryans did. And Aryans are not Europeans, by the way. They were a specific culture in Central Asia. And there is considerable archaeological evidence that there was an Aryan culture. And the word Aryan, again, it comes, don't forget about the Nazi Aryan thing. It's just a word. That was the name of their culture. That culture did exist and disappeared. And it disappeared because of a climate shift. Where they were living in the Central Asian plains of the steppes of Russia, where they were living was very vibrant, and it's really clear in the Vedas that they lived in a really wonderful place to live, and then climate change came and they started looking for a better place to farm. That was all it was. They came down and they ended up coming down into what is now Iran and into Pakistan. And Iranians are descended from those same Aryans. The Persian language and the Sanskrit language are very similar. All right, got it? All right, so the PCB also seems to indicate that the actual Aryan warrior farmer civilization did develop independently in Central Asia long after the other African-descended Indo-European languages, religions, and cultures were firmly established in Europe. While the Aryans were indeed Indo-Europeans, they were not the source of all Indo-European cultures. The Aryans were only one of many Indo-European cultures that had already been established in the Northern Hemisphere for tens of thousands of years. So it seems that science has reversed itself 180 degrees in regards to the genesis of the Indo-European people. In terms of race, skin color has no bearing whatsoever on the Indo-European-ness of any Indo-European culture. Whatever the race or skin color the original Aryans may have possessed had already been altered by climactic factors tens of thousands of years after the original Proto-Indo-European languages, cultures, and religions had been brought by dark-skinned Paleolithic African Proto-Indo-Europeans. In fact, if light skin is a result of exposure to extreme Ice Age conditions, as scientists believe, then it is likely that the Aryans who were residents of the Central Asian steppes may very well have had olive skin in order to better tolerate the harsher, drier conditions of that climate. The Aryans would perhaps have been lighter skinned in comparison to the indigenous Dravidians in the Indian subcontinent that they conquered. The Dravidians is just a word, but the people who lived in the Indian subcontinent were, you can see, really who they were. If you go into, the isolated islands like the Andaman Islands and places around there in, the Indian Ocean, you find very dark-skinned people. They look like Africans. And those would have been the people that were there. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that says that Dravidians were, in fact, Africans. And so you would have had other people coming down. They weren't necessarily white, but they would have probably been lighter skinned. They're coming down and they're, conquering, interbreeding, merging with these Dravidians. And so that's what it's all about. But, people want to make it about these light-skinned, blue-eyed Germanic people coming in, and that's just not at all what happened. In fact, the Europeans had no clue any of this was going on. They were all wrapped up in their own thing. So the word Aryan has nothing to do with Europeans. All right, so the Aryans would probably have been a lighter skinned in comparison to the indigenous Dravidians in the Indian subcontinent that they conquered. This skin color difference would have been reflected in the Vedas. But for us to assume that the lighter skin of the Aryans is identical to the same shade of European skin color is an unjustified assumption. They may or may not have resembled Europeans, but any similarity would have been purely coincidental. DNA studies of modern Indians, meaning East Indians, show no relation whatsoever to modern Europeans. The Aryans were not European. Europeans were not descended from Aryans. So based on the overwhelming evidence in favor of the Paleolithic continuity paradigm, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to ascribe any uniform skin color to the Indo-European languages, religions, or cultures. This means that all of the racial attributes of the other Indo-European cultures developed over tens of thousands of years as well. Seeing as how this Paleolithic continuity paradigm has found independent corroboration in so many different sciences, archaeology, linguistics, genetics, then it is time for us to view ancestry as something not according to skin color, but according to language and religion, both of which seem to be older than temporary fluctuations of skin pigmentation. In other words, while our ancestors' DNA was mutating to adapt to local climates, our language was staying relatively unchanged. With this in mind, we must accept the possibility that the words I am typing now are not as white as we might think. If the PCP is accurate, then I am typing a modern African language which has mutated over tens of thousands of years into what we now call English. Shocking, isn't it? I will save the most shocking evidence for this for the end of the book. I will share with you the Proto-Indo-European word for ancestor that is still being spoken identically in Africa today by the Yoruba people. It has the same pronunciation and the exact same meaning to this very day. This to me is proof positive of the accuracy of the Paleolithic continuity paradigm. It should also be noted that during the pre-Christian Roman era in Europe, racial superiority was ascribed to the civilized, darker-skinned Mediterranean and North African peoples. The light-haired, light-eyed Germanic tribes were considered by the Romans to be the extreme in terms of primitiveness. Romans viewed the Germanic tribes as being the noble savage of their day. This is why Germans were called barbarians. Nowadays, people of Northern European descent like to make themselves look more ethnic, whatever that means, by sitting in tanning booths all day and forcing their naturally straight hair into dreadlocks in a superficial attempt to distance themselves from their self-perceived overly civilized white background. Ironically, 2,000 years ago in Rome, senators' wives were bleaching their black hair platinum blonde and trying to keep their olive skin out of the sun in an attempt to look more like the sexy, exotic, primitive, tribal Germanic slave girl. Which does sound pretty hot, I have to say. So in light of the anthropological evidence, I think we can safely say that the level of one's spiritual consciousness does not depend on their ethnic background, but on the accumulation of their actions and experiences. Once again, my apologies for the lengthy discussion concerning race and skin color for those new to the Northern traditions who are not constantly bombarded with the racial controversies and modern neo-heathenism. My apologies. Since it is possible that this book may be read by neo-heathens who are unsure about the importance of race within the Northern traditions, I felt it necessary to do my best to kill the racialist arguments once and for all. I may not have completely succeeded in destroying racism and modern neo-heathenism, but at least those with open minds can now rationally and logically weigh the objective evidence, scientific evidence themselves, and come to their own opinions. When I wrote this, I didn't realize how much animosity there is among people having to do with science in general. So I might have just completely wasted my time trying to appeal to, scientific, because just people in general just will throw science away for no reason. One of my most recent comments, I think it was did NASA lie to you? Somebody just wrote, I don't trust those people. It just made me go, oh my God, it has nothing to do with them. Don't you get it? It's not about those people. It's about the objective evidence. Oh yeah. Drives me crazy. It drives me crazy because I see such childishness, I see such fear, and I see such willful ignorance. People choosing not to know for whatever fear-based reason. It angers me. I wish I had a more effective way of responding to it, but all it does is just make me angry. Anyway, I'm doing my best. All right, so I'm ready to stop here for the moment. Let's see, what page are we on? We are on page 69. Ooh. We're on page 69, and the book goes for a long way. I'll answer some questions, and then maybe we'll keep this thing going, or maybe not, depending on the kind of questions we have. So let's back it up to page 69. And who doesn't like that page number? All right. Let's see here. Again, I'm going to be looking for the questions. Renee Battlewoman of the Woods. What kind of qi does the ocean have, and is this qi made more accessible by qigong near the ocean? Well, you're dealing with the water element. There's a reason why I feel so much better after I've been surfing for 2 hours. For me, it's definitely a connection to Shakti, to the mother. I feel very nourished afterwards. And you can tell, you can see the difference before. If I make a video and I haven't surfed for a couple of weeks after, and I've just made a video and I've been surfing like I was yesterday, you can see a lot more calmness in me and a lot more comfort because it nurtures me. So is that going to be more accessible by doing qigong near the ocean? I would think so. Second question. How much of the original chi of the Neanderthals do we still have as their ancestors? That I don't know. Anywhere from 1 to 4%. So I can't honestly say. I do think that we have access to them. But there's also, when I wrote this, I wasn't aware of the Denisovans. So there were the Neanderthals in the Near East and in Europe and Siberia and all that. And then there was the Denisovans, who were more in the Asian regions. So the Denisovans and the Neanderthals were, different species of humans. So more than likely, you can find Neanderthal kind of everywhere in the world north of Africa, but you find Denisovan DNA more in the Far East. That make sense? I wasn't aware of that when I wrote this book, so that might have changed how I wrote it. Let's see, what else? Is the race agenda part of Kali Yuga? Well, yeah, Kali Yuga, which ended in the Middle Ages, at the end of the Middle Ages, was when we were the furthest away from the galactic center, which meant that we were farthest away from our source of divinity. And so Kali Yuga, 25% of the population was awakened, 75% of the population was in unconsciousness. Now we have moved into Dvapara Yuga, which means we're moving towards half and half, which is why everything is so divided, why politics is so divided, because half of the world is still unconscious and half of the world, which means another 25%, is waking up. They're becoming woke, yo. And so, yeah, I would say definitely. You don't see that. I mean, even though I think that, white racism has come from the reaction of the barbarians in Europe to Roman racism, which was not as intense. They definitely had a racialist aspect, but they weren't as hardcore about it. But what happens with people when they're abused, when they are conquered, when their religion is taken away from them, they tend to emulate their captors, their conquerors, and they overcompensate. So they take on, there's a reason why white people are so racist. It's because way back then, during the Roman times, those were the guys who were targeted the most. They were targeted and enslaved and warred against and all of that. So that's why. That's why when people when they don't work through their pain, they end up taking on the disease of whatever's brought on them, and then they compensate for it and improve on it. So anyway, what was I saying? I don't remember now. Stormageddon, Dark Lord of All. Question: how do we work through this 2,000-year-old unconscious wound? We can only work on it ourselves. We only have power over ourselves. We don't have any power over anybody else. So I'm doing my part. I've wrote this book. I'm reading all this, and to be honest with you, it's just like it's hard for me to get through it all. And I wrote it because I wanted to make my stance clear. At the time I was writing it, there was a lot of pressure coming at me from, because nobody knew who I was, and I was saying all this new stuff that nobody had ever heard of before, and people were really slamming me hard time, and I was really getting attacked by the racists. And it was either that I did what I do and I stood up and fought against it, or I just knuckled under and just walked away from it. Those were my only real choices. But after having had such a powerful experience with the Nordic deities, after having had such a positive and powerful experience, I couldn't walk away from it. So the only other choice I had was to fight. So that's what I did. This is me, writing and doing all of this intellectual, scientific work to explain away racism was my way of staying in this fight and staying as a vehicle and a voice for the knowledge of my ancestors and the runes. And now, if I want to talk about it, I really will talk more about runes than anything else. So, and I really don't think about it as much, which is why it's so annoying to me when the racists pop up on my channel. It's just like, I'm trying to forget about that crap, you know, and it frustrates me that they find me. You know, I wish they would just stay away, because I get so violently angry, and I don't like feeling that way. How else do you deal with people who just have, you know, a brick for brains? How do you deal with it? Anyway, so my answer to your question, sir, is the only thing to do is just work on yourself. You can't do anything for anybody else. Daniel Cardenas' question: what is your perspective on this coronavirus pandemic? My perspective, Daniel, is welcome to the channel. I assume that you're new, because if you weren't new, you would know that I don't like taking questions that aren't related to what I'm teaching. It's disrespectful to me, not in this case, because normally, you know, if you're talking about another teacher, but it's disrespectful to me. You know, you're trying to distract me from what we're talking about. What do you want? What do you mean my perspective? What do you want to know? What are you asking me? Are you asking me, do I believe that it's a pandemic, or do I believe that it's fake? I don't really want to answer the question. I have answered it in numerous videos. So welcome to my channel. You can type in pandemic or something else onto the search function within my channel, learn how to do that, and you can watch me talk about it. I don't really want to talk about it today. Let's see what else. Yep. All right. So I don't see anything else here. All right. So I'm tired. all that intellectual talking, racism crap made me tired. So I'm gonna stop for today, and yeah, that's it. I don't got nothing more to say. Need to go take a nap and eat some food or something. All right. Oh, by the way, in case, did I say I got my next visa for 6 months, which I hear I can reapply again at the end of 6 months, and all I'm hoping for is that the international borders open again. And then if that happens, then I can go back to doing what I was doing. What I don't want to have to do is I don't want to have to leave here and go back to the States. I don't want to go back to the States right now with all the garbage going on. So yeah, I've come to accept that. I'm hoping that things will change and I don't have to end up going back to the States. Yeah, that's it. All right, so keep your positive thoughts for me in that regard. And outside of that, I think I'm done. I think I need to go take a nap. All right, guys, that's it for me. Obviously, there will be a part 4 and 5 of this because it's such a long book. And I hope you enjoyed it. I'll check and see if there are any last minute questions. Nope. All right, thanks, guys. Talk to you later.